A bus driver was seconds from pulling away when a small dog threw himself in front of the vehicle, refusing to let it leave. What the dog led him to just moments later would leave everyone frozen in shock. The morning air in Eastbridge was thick with fog, muffling the usual bustle of city life. Just as Bus 17A prepared to pull away from the terminal, a sudden, high-pitched bark pierced the quiet. Passengers turned with alarm to see a small Jack Russell Terrier desperately jumping at the front of the vehicle, its eyes wide with frantic urgency. Behind the wheel, longtime driver Thomas Riley froze, his hand hovering inches from the door control button. He'd witnessed a lot in his 15 years navigating city routes, but this was different. This wasn't a dog merely chasing a bus. It was pleading, urgently, intelligently, and it was staring directly at him. Thomas's instincts kicked in. His hand trembled slightly as he pulled away from the button. Something about the terrier's behavior drilled into his gut. It wasn't looking for a ride. It was asking for help. In the rear of the bus, murmurs turned into complaints. "What's going on now?" grumbled a man in a sharp gray blazer. "Are we waiting for a dog to buy a ticket?" Thomas ignored him, eyes locked on the little dog whose collar clinked with every frantic leap. The metal tags flashed as the sunlight broke through the clouds overhead. The terrier barked once more, then darted a few feet down the sidewalk, before pausing and glancing back at the driver with unmistakable urgency in its eyes. "I can't just leave the route," Thomas muttered, more to himself than to anyone else, glancing at his watch. He was already behind schedule. The transit office had been strict lately, but something about the dog's behavior tugged at him. Relentless, purposeful. It wasn't wandering. It was leading. "Ladies and gentlemen," Thomas finally called out over the intercom, "I need to step off for a moment. There may be an emergency. I ask for your patience." The passengers responded with groans and protests, but Thomas was already reaching under his seat, pulling out the standard issue first aid kit. As he stepped off the bus, the terrier immediately ran to his feet, gave a small circle, and then bolted down the sidewalk. Thomas followed without hesitation. The streets were still quiet, the air damp with morning dew. The dog moved fast, too fast for something aimless. It darted past a bakery and a newsstand, finally slipping into a narrow alley between two closed storefronts. Thomas hesitated for a split second before stepping in. There, in the shadowed alley behind a stack of flattened boxes, lay a crumpled figure. "Oh no," Thomas whispered, heart thundering in his chest. An elderly woman, gray hair tied back neatly, dressed in a vivid violet dress, was lying face down on the concrete. The terrier whimpered softly, gently nudging her hand. Thomas dropped to his knees, fingers searching for a pulse. Relief surged through him when he found a faint but steady beat. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" he asked, carefully rolling her to her side. Her eyelids fluttered, lips parting slightly. "Benny," she murmured. Thomas glanced at the dog, whose ears perked up. "So your name's Benny, huh?" The little terrier let out a quiet yip in response. "It's okay," Thomas assured her, though his own nerves were fraying. "Help's on the way." He turned toward the mouth of the alley. "Somebody call an ambulance." A young woman in a crimson hoodie pulled out her phone, fingers flying. As she spoke to dispatch, Thomas spotted a medical alert bracelet on the woman's wrist. He leaned closer and squinted at the engraving. Nora Wexley, type 1, diabetes. A chill passed through him. "Ms. Wexley?" he asked louder. "Are you diabetic? Do you need sugar?" Her unfocused eyes blinked slowly, then a faint nod. Thomas turned to the group now forming at the edge of the alley. "Does anyone have candy? Soda? Anything sweet?" People began searching bags and pockets. Thomas stayed kneeling by the woman's side. Benny still pressed close to her shoulder. A boy in a school uniform pushed forward, holding out a bright orange can. "Fizzy drink?" Thomas nodded, cracking it open and lifting Nora's head to help her sip. All around, people watched in stunned silence. Some filming, some whispering. But Benny stayed focused, eyes never leaving his owner's face. Thomas kept whispering calm reassurances, unaware that his life was already changing forever. He thought he was just helping a lost dog, but what he uncovered was a life-or-death emergency hidden in plain sight. This wasn't a coincidence. It was a rescue mission planned by a four-legged hero. As Nora sipped slowly from the can, her breathing began to steady. Thomas supported her head gently, watching her color return bit by bit. The tight knot in his chest began to ease. The terrier, Benny, sat pressed against Nora's side, never once distracted by the commotion building around them. A siren began to wail in the distance, growing louder with every passing second. Someone had succeeded in reaching emergency services. Thomas glanced toward the alley entrance where more bystanders had gathered, whispering and recording on their phones. Most looked on in confusion, but a few had faces etched with concern. "She's diabetic," Thomas called to no one in particular, trying to explain what had happened. "The dog, he stopped my bus, led me here. She could have died." The disbelief on some faces melted into amazement. A few heads turned toward Benny with a new kind of reverence. The small dog had understood something no human nearby had noticed. It had seen the warning signs, taken action, and led help straight to its owner. Thomas knelt beside the terrier, scratching gently behind its ears. "You're a smart one, aren't you, boy?" Benny let out a soft bark, not seeking attention, just reassured by Thomas's calm presence. Moments later, a pair of paramedics hurried into the alley with a stretcher and medical equipment. They knelt beside Nora, quickly assessing her condition while speaking in hushed, focused tones. Thomas backed away, giving them space, but his eyes never left the scene. One of the paramedics looked up after checking her vitals. "It's good you got here when you did," she said. "Her blood sugar dropped dangerously low. Another 20 or 30 minutes, and it could have been too late." Thomas nodded solemnly, watching as they gently lifted Nora onto the stretcher. Her eyes opened briefly, blinking against the light. They found Benny first, then locked onto Thomas. Her lips trembled. "Thank you," she murmured. "My boy, he found you?" Her voice was frail, but the gratitude in her eyes was overwhelming. "Yes, ma'am," Thomas replied. "He made sure I didn't leave. He led me right to you." The paramedics loaded Nora into the ambulance, and Benny whimpered as they began to close the doors. "Wait," Thomas called, stepping forward. "Does she have any family? Someone who can take the dog?" One of the medics shook her head. "We don't have that information yet. If no one claims him, animal control will be notified." The words hit Thomas harder than he expected. Benny had just saved a life. The idea of him being locked in a shelter alone didn't sit right. Without thinking, Thomas said, "I'll take him, at least for now, until she's back on her feet." The medic gave him a nod. "That's kind of you." She handed him a leash from Nora's bag and closed the ambulance doors. As the vehicle pulled away, sirens fading into the distance, the alley fell into a strange, reflective silence. Thomas looked down at Benny, who stared after the ambulance with quiet intensity. "We'll make sure she's okay," he said softly. "You did good, Benny. Real good." As the crowd began to disperse, a young constable made his way toward Thomas, notepad in hand. "Excuse me, sir," he said in a steady voice. "I need to take a statement. This all sounds unusual." Thomas nodded, still dazed by the morning's events. "Yeah, I know. It is. But every word of it's true." The constable raised a brow as he jotted notes. "So the dog stopped your bus and led you here? Intentionally?" Thomas met his gaze, speaking with certainty. "Yes. He knew she needed help." Benny, sitting calmly at his feet, let out a small huff as if in agreement. The officer looked down at the dog, then back up at Thomas. "Well, stranger things have happened. You'd be surprised what these little ones are capable of." Thomas smiled faintly, already feeling a bond forming with the terrier who had so unexpectedly entered his life. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. One man's split-second decision to follow a dog would spark a chain of events he never could have imagined. What started as a simple detour was about to flip his entire world upside down. Thomas Riley stood at the mouth of the alley, Benny's leash wrapped gently in his hand, unsure of what to do next. The bus he'd abandoned still sat idle a few blocks away, likely surrounded by impatient passengers and questions he wasn't ready to answer. But right now, none of that mattered. Benny leaned against his leg, trembling slightly, still watching the direction the ambulance had vanished into. "You all right, little guy?" Thomas murmured. Benny didn't respond, but the look in his eyes said more than any words could. He wasn't just a dog. He was a lifeline, a protector, a friend. A few moments passed before a loud, annoyed voice snapped Thomas back to reality. "There he is!" came the shout from a block away. A group of passengers from Bus 17A had followed the trail, led by none other than the man in the gray blazer. "You left us stranded, mate. What kind of driver abandons his post like that?" Thomas straightened, bracing himself for the confrontation. "There was an emergency," he said firmly. "A woman's life was on the line." But the man wasn't ready to listen. "That doesn't give you the right to ditch your passengers in the middle of a commute. People have jobs, appointments." "She was unconscious," Thomas snapped, louder than intended, "lying in an alley alone. And this dog led me right to her. If I hadn't followed him, she might have died." The passengers paused, some of them visibly softening. A young woman stepped forward. Thomas recognized her as the one who had called the ambulance. "It's true," she said. "I saw it. The dog stopped the bus and wouldn't let it leave. He knew something was wrong." The businessman looked around, suddenly aware of the shifting mood. His irritation gave way to sheepishness. I didn't know," he mumbled. Thomas gave a short nod. "No one did, except him." He looked down at Benny, who now sat calmly at his side, gaze fixed protectively on the group in front of him. The businessman adjusted his collar awkwardly. "Sorry then. Guess I jumped to conclusions." "Don't worry about it," Thomas replied, voice steady now. "Just sometimes it pays to stop and look before judging what you don't understand." Before more could be said, the young constable stepped forward again. "Mr. Riley will be in touch if we need further details. For now, take care of that dog." With the crowd dispersing, Thomas turned back toward the bus depot. The reality of the day was setting in. He still had to report to his supervisor, still had to explain why his route was left abandoned. But as Benny trotted beside him, ears perked and tail flicking, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that whatever consequences waited for him, they would be worth it. By the time they reached the depot, the city's traffic had picked up. Horns honked, engines rumbled, and a sea of buses came and went. The imposing brick building loomed ahead, its glass doors already swinging open as drivers ended their shifts. Thomas hesitated, then gave Benny a reassuring pat. "Let's go face the music, partner." Inside, the air was thick with diesel fumes and frustration. Dispatchers shouted over radios, drivers compared schedules. No one noticed him at first, until he reached the office at the end of the hall. "Come in," came the gruff voice from within. Thomas pushed the door open, revealing his supervisor, Alan Griggs, hunched over a desk piled high with paperwork. The older man looked up, scowling the moment he saw Thomas. "You've got half the city complaining, Riley. Gerrard Street route's been frozen for over an hour. I'd better hear something good." Thomas took a deep breath, Benny stepping beside him like a silent wingman. "Sir, I need to explain what happened. But first, you should know this dog just saved a woman's life." He braced himself, then launched into the full story. Every word, every step, every bark. As he spoke, Griggs's scowl slowly faded. Then, to Thomas's complete surprise, the man leaned back in his chair and let out a slow whistle. "That's one hell of a morning, Riley, and one hell of a dog." Thomas couldn't help but nod. "Yes, sir, he's something else." Griggs studied him for a long moment before cracking a rare smile. "Maybe you were in the right place at the right time. Or maybe he was." Thomas wasn't sure what to say, but deep down, he already knew. This wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning. 40. He never wanted a dog, never planned to be a hero, but fate had other plans. And now, both of their lives were on a path they couldn't turn back from. Thomas Riley walked out of the supervisor's office stunned, not with fear, but with a strange sense of purpose. Benny walked in sync beside him, tail up, as if he too understood something big had just happened. The depot buzzed with noise and motion, but for Thomas, it felt like time had slowed. He wasn't sure what came next, but he knew one thing. He wasn't letting Benny go. Back at his modest flat in the north end of Eastbridge, Thomas opened the door and let Benny inside. The terrier stepped cautiously at first, sniffing the corners, circling the small rug in the living room. His paw pads clicked softly on the hardwood floor, and his nose twitched as he scanned this unfamiliar space. Thomas stood watching, unsure of what to expect. He'd lived alone for years, by choice mostly. A dog had never factored into that. But watching Benny curl up in the worn armchair by the window, as if it were already his, Thomas couldn't deny how natural it felt. "Guess this place is yours now, too," he muttered, half smiling. Benny gave a quiet huff in response and closed his eyes. That night, Thomas barely slept. He kept listening for small sounds. Benny stirring, scratching, whimpering. But the terrier slept peacefully, as if reassured that his job, for now, was done. The next morning brought a new surprise, a call from the hospital. Nora Wexley was awake, stable, and asking about her dog. Thomas didn't hesitate. He bundled Benny into his old station wagon and drove straight to Eastbridge General. The nurse at the front desk lit up when she saw Benny. "She's been asking for him all morning," she said with a grin. As Thomas entered the hospital room, Benny's tail went wild. Nora sat propped up in bed, her pale face now full of warmth. "There's my boy!" she cried, and Benny leapt gently onto the mattress, snuggling close to her. Tears welled in her eyes as she stroked his fur. "You saved me, didn't you, love?" Thomas stood back, unsure of what to say. Nora turned her eyes toward him. "And you're the driver, aren't you? The one who followed him?" Thomas nodded. "That's right. He wouldn't let me leave. He made sure I came after him." She laughed softly, brushing Benny's ears. "He's clever like that. I rescued him 6 years ago, but I swear he's rescued me 100 times since. You've seen what he's capable of now." They talked for a while, about Benny, about the morning it all happened, and about the strange way life has of throwing people together at the exact right time. Nora told Thomas about her life as a retired school teacher, her quiet routines, and how Benny was the one constant through it all. Thomas hesitated as the conversation wound down. "I was wondering," he said gently, "if I could visit him sometimes. I've gotten a little attached." Nora's eyes softened. "Of course, you're part of his story now." She paused, then added, "In fact, I help out at the Eastbridge Animal Haven. We're always short on hands. And I think you'd fit right in." Thomas blinked. "Me? At a shelter?" She nodded. "Something tells me you've got more to give than just bus routes." The thought lingered in his mind long after they left the hospital. Could he really do that? Volunteer at a shelter? He had no experience, no animal background. But something about Nora's words and Benny's quiet companionship made the idea stick. The next weekend, Thomas found himself walking through the front doors of Eastbridge Animal Haven. Benny trotted confidently beside him like a veteran. Inside, a chorus of barks, meows, and chirps echoed off the walls. A young woman with a short pixie cut and a clipboard met them at the front desk. "You must be Thomas," she said. "I'm Mia. Nora told us about you and this little legend." She knelt to scratch Benny's head. "Welcome to the team." Thomas wasn't sure what he'd expected. But by the end of the day, after cleaning kennels, walking anxious dogs, and soothing a trembling kitten, he realized something surprising. He felt good, needed, useful in a way he hadn't in years. And Benny? He was right at home, trotting from cage to cage like a four-legged supervisor. Every animal seemed to calm under his presence. This wasn't just an accident. It was the beginning of something far bigger. A chance encounter had brought them together, but what they were about to face would test not just courage, but conviction. The real fight hadn't even started yet. In the weeks that followed, Thomas settled into an entirely new rhythm of life. Mornings were spent driving his usual city routes, but afternoons and weekends were now reserved for the Eastbridge Animal Haven. What began as a temporary volunteer gig soon became something far deeper, something that gave his days meaning. Benny was always by his side, tail wagging, eyes bright, as if he'd found his true calling too. He quickly became the shelter's unofficial mascot, a calming presence for frightened animals and anxious visitors. People came in hoping to adopt a pet, but many left talking about the little Jack Russell who had once stopped a bus to save a life. The shelter posted the story online, and it went viral. Local news outlets picked it up. Soon, Thomas and Benny were invited for an interview on a popular morning show. "You were just driving your usual route that day," the host said, leaning forward. "Did you have any idea your life was about to change?" Thomas gave a soft laugh. "None. If you told me a dog would be my co-pilot in life, I'd have called you mad. But now, I can't imagine it any other way." What no one expected was how the media attention would ripple beyond feel-good headlines. One day, as Thomas was locking up the shelter after a long shift, he noticed a black SUV idling across the street. He didn't think much of it until the passenger window rolled down slowly. Inside sat a man in a tailored coat, his face hard, expression unreadable. "Mr. Riley," the man called out, voice smooth and cold. "A word." Thomas stiffened. "Can I help you?" "You're causing waves," the man said, not stepping out. "The awareness campaign, the interviews, the stories. They're drawing attention to operations that prefer to stay private." It took Thomas a moment to grasp the implication. His throat tightened. "Puppy mills?" he said, barely above a whisper. The man didn't answer directly. "Let's just say, not everyone is pleased. I'm here to offer you a piece of advice. Stop." Thomas's stomach dropped. He wasn't some seasoned activist. He was just a driver who happened to follow a dog. But now he was being warned, threatened. "And if I don't?" The man's eyes narrowed. "You won't like what follows." Then without another word, the SUV pulled away, disappearing into the evening traffic. Thomas stood frozen for a long moment, Benny watching silently at his side. For the first time since that morning in the alley, fear crept into his bones. Not for himself, but for the animals, for Nora, for Benny. He went home that night and sat in the dark, replaying the conversation in his head. The next morning he called Nora. "Something's happened," he told her. She listened carefully as he explained everything, then said, "You don't have to do this, Thomas. No one would blame you if you step back." But as he looked down at Benny, curled at his feet, Thomas shook his head. "I do have to do this. They're counting on us." And so he doubled down. The shelter launched a full campaign. Billboards, videos, adoption drives. Thomas used every spare minute to help build momentum. His face became the symbol of their message. "Don't buy pain. Adopt hope." That was their slogan. And Benny, he was the heart behind it all. But with every step forward, the pressure mounted. Anonymous messages, late-night phone calls. One morning, Thomas found his car windshield shattered, a note left under the wiper. "Walk away." The police took reports but found nothing conclusive. "We'll keep an eye out," they said. But it didn't feel like enough. Despite everything, Thomas refused to quit. He'd seen what neglect looked like. He'd held trembling puppies who'd never known kindness. He'd looked into Benny's eyes and realized just how much one dog could understand, how much one person could do if they dared to act. He wasn't just protecting animals anymore. He was protecting the truth. And even though the shadows were closing in, he wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. He stood up for those who couldn't speak, but now someone wanted to silence him. What happened next would push him beyond anything he thought he could endure. The threats no longer felt like empty warnings. The broken windshield, the SUV, the messages, they were pieces of something bigger, something dangerous. But Thomas refused to let fear dictate his path. At the shelter, he continued showing up day after day, speaking at events, visiting schools, and standing beside Benny as the face of a growing movement. The community rallied behind them. Donations poured in, volunteers signed up. A local graphic designer offered to create posters and online content for free. The campaign, once just a handful of people trying to make a difference, had grown into a citywide force. Even Eastbridge's mayor issued a public statement supporting their cause. But the higher they climbed, the more pressure they felt. One night, after locking up the shelter, Thomas took a different route home, paranoia creeping into his gut. He glanced in the rearview mirror every few blocks. No black SUV, no shadowy figures. Still, the fear lingered. Then came the breaking point. It was a Thursday night. Crisp autumn winds swept through the streets. Thomas stayed late at the shelter to prepare for a charity fundraiser. Benny, as always, lay curled in the office corner, keeping watch. As Thomas gathered supplies, he heard something. A noise. Subtle. Metallic. Like a door latch. He froze. "Hello!" he called, stepping into the hallway. Nothing. The lights flickered faintly above. He was about to brush it off when suddenly, crash! The back door burst open. Two masked men rushed in. Thomas had no time to react. One grabbed him by the collar, shoving him against the wall. Benny leapt to his feet, barking furiously, but one of the intruders kicked a nearby chair to block the dog's path. "You don't listen well," growled one of the men. "We warned you." Thomas struggled. "You're making a mistake." "No," the man snapped. "You did. Now it's your turn to feel what you're messing with." They dragged Thomas out the back door and shoved him into a waiting van. His heart pounded. This was no scare tactic anymore. It was abduction. The van sped off, weaving through the outskirts of Eastbridge. Inside, Thomas stayed silent, counting seconds, mapping turns in his head. He couldn't let panic win. Somewhere behind them, Benny's bark still echoed in his ears. After what felt like hours, the vehicle slowed. The doors swung open. The men hauled him out into an abandoned warehouse, the same one the shelter had once investigated on suspicion of illegal breeding. Now it wasn't just suspicion. Inside were cages, dozens of them, lined up along the walls, filled with trembling dogs, too young, too sick, too silent. A man emerged from the shadows, not masked, not angry, calm, controlled, the same man from the SUV. "Mr. Riley," he said smoothly, "I'm disappointed. We could have resolved this quietly." Thomas glared at him. "You abuse animals for profit. There's nothing quiet about that." The man's smile faded. "You have a choice. Help us move this operation. Make a public statement retracting your campaign. Say it was exaggerated, a misunderstanding, or—" he glanced at the cages. "We shut down the shelter. Permanently." Thomas clenched his fist. "You'd hurt those animals to protect your business?" "They're assets," the man said coldly. "Collateral." Before Thomas could respond, chaos erupted. A loud bark shattered the air. Then another. The warehouse door flew open, and in rushed police officers, flashlights slicing through the dark. Leading the charge, Benny, leash in the hands of a breathless but determined Nora Wexley. "Dave!" she shouted, using the alias Thomas had adopted during the campaign to protect his real name. "We found you!" Thomas blinked in shock as officers tackled the masked men, shouting orders, freeing the caged dogs. Nora ran to his side, breath ragged. Benny wouldn't stop barking. When you didn't come home, he knew something was wrong. "He led me straight here." Thomas dropped to his knees and pulled Benny into his arms. "You did it again," he whispered. "You found me." The man from the SUV tried to escape, but it was too late. The authorities had everything. And Thomas? He had something even more powerful. Proof, justice, and a dog who refused to let him fall. He thought the danger had passed, but the aftermath would test his strength in a whole new way. Not every battle leaves bruises you can see. The raid at the warehouse made national news. The footage was everywhere. Cages flung open, terrified dogs rescued, officers escorting masked men in handcuffs, and at the center of it all, a small Jack Russell Terrier named Benny. Reporters called him the dog with a mission, and Thomas? He became a symbol of resilience in the face of corruption. But behind the headlines, the emotional toll hit harder than anyone expected. For days after the rescue, Thomas barely slept. Images from the warehouse haunted him, the faces of the abused dogs, the sharp bark of Benny echoing in the dark, the chilling threat of the man in the SUV. Even with the support of the community, even with Nora and Benny by his side, he felt the weight of every animal he hadn't saved, every second he'd spent helpless inside those cold walls. Nora noticed first. "You're not eating much," she said gently one evening, as Thomas sat staring into his untouched plate. Benny lay at his feet, ears perked, watching him with quiet concern. "You haven't taken a day off since it happened." "I can't," Thomas replied, voice low. "Not until everything's done. There's still so much to fix." "But you can't pour from an empty cup," Nora said. "Even heroes need rest." The word hero didn't sit right with him. He wasn't trying to be one. He just wanted to do the right thing. Still, her words lingered. A few days later, he found himself at the shelter after hours, the building quiet except for the low hum of heaters and the occasional rustle of paws. He stood outside the room where many of the rescued dogs were being rehabilitated, some still afraid of human contact, others slowly warming to their new reality. Mia, the volunteer coordinator, appeared beside him. "You're doing more than anyone ever asked for, you know," she said. "They trust you. And Benny? He's their light. I think they look to him like they would to a pack leader." Thomas smiled faintly. Benny had indeed taken to the role with astonishing grace. He was everywhere at once, sniffing the cages, licking the trembling ones, curling up beside the shy ones. He had an energy that made the broken ones believe again. In the weeks that followed, Eastbridge Animal Haven underwent rapid changes. Donations from across the country poured in. The facility expanded, adding new space, better equipment, and a trauma care unit. A generous philanthropist even funded a memorial garden for the rescued dogs who hadn't made it, those who were saved too late. But as the shelter grew, so did the movement. Thomas was invited to speak at events, consult with advocacy groups, and assist in launching a citywide initiative that aimed to permanently shut down illegal breeding operations. It was more than he'd ever imagined his life becoming. And yet, in quieter moments, when he sat alone at home with Benny curled against his leg, the gravity of it all pressed in. "How did this happen?" he once whispered to the terrier. "I was just a bus driver." Benny lifted his head, eyes meeting Thomas's with unwavering certainty. "You knew," Thomas continued softly. "You knew she needed help. You knew where I needed to be. And somehow that led us here." That night, Thomas wrote a journal entry, something he hadn't done in years. "I used to measure my day by route numbers and bus stops. Now I measure it in lives changed, animals healed, and chances taken. All because a dog refused to let me look away." It wasn't just about rescuing others anymore. Somewhere in this whirlwind, he'd rescued himself too. But the road ahead was still long, and the next step would define everything they'd built so far. The world saw him as a hero, but behind the scenes, he was preparing for a battle far greater than anything he'd faced. This time, it wasn't just about saving lives. It was about changing the system. The warehouse bust had set off a storm. Arrests were made, investigations launched, and legal proceedings began rolling like thunder through the courts. But even with justice in motion, Thomas knew the problem wasn't over. Dozens of animals had been saved, yes, but dozens more were still out there, hidden behind closed doors and beneath fake licenses. He wasn't content with just one victory. He wanted reform, real, lasting reform. It started with a meeting at Eastbridge City Hall. Thomas sat across from council members, Nora at his side, Benny curled at his feet. On the table were folders filled with data, evidence, shelter statistics, rescue numbers. But no number was more powerful than the story Thomas told. "I was just a driver," he began. "I didn't plan to become an advocate. But one dog refused to let me ignore what was happening. And that decision, to follow him, opened my eyes to a world I'd never seen." Council members leaned in. They'd all heard about the story, seen the headlines, but hearing it firsthand hit differently. Thomas didn't hold back. He described the cages, the smell of urine and fear, the quiet pain in the eyes of the dogs who didn't even cry anymore. "What we need," he concluded, "is oversight. Licensing, surprise inspections, real accountability. Because without it, this will keep happening. and next time Benny might not be there in time. The room was quiet when he finished. Then came the nods, then applause. Soon after, the Eastbridge Companion Protection Act was drafted, a local ordinance that would become the city's strongest line of defense against illegal breeders. Mandatory checks, higher penalties, a city-run registry of legitimate adoption centers. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start, and it had Thomas's name all over it. The shelter threw a celebration the day the ordinance passed. There were banners, news crews, and families adopting dogs rescued from the warehouse. Benny wore a little vest that read, Chief Rescue Officer, and posed for photos like a seasoned pro. But while everyone else celebrated, Thomas stepped outside for a moment of quiet. The late afternoon sun bathed the city in gold. He stood on the shelter steps, watching the skyline. Everything looked the same. The traffic, the buildings, the sidewalks he used to walk alone. But inside, he was different. He wasn't the man who had driven the 17A route every morning without fail. He was someone else now, someone who had been called into a fight he never expected and didn't back down. Behind him, Nora joined him on the steps, holding 2 cups of tea. I remember the first time you walked through the shelter doors, she said with a soft smile. I thought, this poor man looks like he got tricked into volunteering. Thomas chuckled. I think I did. By a dog. Not just a dog, she corrected. That dog. They looked back through the window where Benny sat beside a young girl, licking her fingers gently while her parents filled out adoption forms for a rescued puppy. The sight filled Thomas with warmth. I've been thinking, he said, sipping his tea. What if this was just the beginning? What if we could take this further? Statewide, maybe even national? Nora raised a brow. You mean start a movement? Thomas nodded. Not just about shutting down bad actors, about promoting real, ethical adoption, changing how people see animals, not as property, but as family. It was a big idea, maybe too big. But then again, wasn't it always the smallest spark that lit the biggest fires? That night back home, Thomas sat with his journal again. Benny lay across his lap, snoring softly. I used to think making a difference was for other people. People with power, or money, or platforms. But sometimes all it takes is a bark, a moment, a decision to follow it, even if you're not sure where it leads. He closed the book with a quiet sense of peace. But as he looked down at Benny, his heart stirred with something else. Purpose. Because Benny hadn't just led him to Nora that morning. He'd led him to who he was meant to become. He answered a dog's desperate plea. But now the voice calling him forward was his own, and it was louder than ever. What came next would ripple far beyond Eastbridge. A month after the city ordinance passed, Thomas received an unexpected letter. It bore the seal of the National Companion Welfare Alliance, one of the largest animal advocacy organizations in the country. They had read about the Eastbridge campaign, the rescue operation, the dog who stopped a bus, and they wanted Thomas to speak at their upcoming summit in London. At first he hesitated. Public speaking wasn't something he ever imagined for himself. He was more comfortable behind the wheel of a bus than behind a podium. But Nora's encouragement was unwavering. You've lived the story, Thomas, she told him. And people don't just want data. They want truth. They want heart. You have both. So he said yes. The following week, Thomas and Benny boarded a train bound for the capital. It was Benny's first time traveling so far, but the little terrier handled it with his usual calm, ears perked, eyes alert, his body pressed close to Thomas's side. At the summit, the ballroom buzzed with voices from around the world. Activists, shelter workers, lawmakers, donors. All gathered with one goal, to change the future for animals. When Thomas stepped on stage, lights warming his face, he didn't read from a script. He spoke from memory, from the heart. I'm not a politician, he began. I'm not a vet or a CEO or an expert. I'm just someone who listened when a dog barked, who followed when he asked me to, and that one decision changed everything. He told them about the alley, about Nora, about the shelter, about the warehouse, and through it all, Benny lay quietly at the foot of the podium, as if he understood every word. I believe we don't just rescue animals, Thomas continued. They rescue us too. They remind us of the better parts of ourselves, of loyalty, courage, instinct, and love. And that's why we can't look away. Not anymore. When he finished, the silence in the room was heavy. Then came the applause, thunderous, heartfelt, and lasting. People stood, some with tears in their eyes. And Thomas? He simply looked down at Benny and smiled. After the summit, offers poured in. Interviews, collaborations, even a documentary proposal. But Thomas remained grounded. He returned to Eastbridge with Benny and went back to work at the shelter. Because for all the attention and praise, he never forgot where it began. Not with speeches, not with laws, but with action. At Eastbridge Animal Haven, changes continued. A new wing was built, named Benny's Hall, dedicated to trauma recovery for rescued dogs. A local university began partnering with the shelter to create an educational outreach program, training students to detect signs of animal abuse in their future careers, whether in medicine, law enforcement, or social work. One afternoon, as Thomas helped a family pick out their first rescue dog, a little boy tugged on his sleeve. "Is it true your dog stopped a whole bus?" he asked, eyes wide. Thomas chuckled. "It's true." "Wow," the boy whispered. "He's like magic." Thomas knelt beside him. "Maybe, but I think he just knew something we didn't, and he wasn't afraid to speak up." Benny, as if on cue, gave a short bark and trotted over to the boy, tail wagging. The child giggled and patted his head. The parents smiled. Another dog found a home that day. Another family was changed. That evening, as the sun dipped below the rooftops, casting warm gold across the shelter yard, Thomas sat on a bench beneath a tree planted in memory of the dogs who never got their second chance. Benny rested beside him, eyes half closed, ears twitching at distant sounds. "Do you ever think about that morning?" Thomas asked softly. "When you stopped the bus? What made you so sure I'd listen?" Of course, Benny didn't answer, but his tail gave a soft thump against the bench leg, as if to say, "I just knew." And Thomas, now fully aware of what had grown from that one moment of trust, reached down and ruffled his ears. "You knew before I did, about everything." But deep down, he also knew. Their journey wasn't over. Not yet. One dog's courage lit the spark, but the man who followed him became the flame. Together, they didn't just change lives, they changed the world. 1 year to the day after that fateful morning, the day Benny stopped a city bus in its tracks, Eastbridge Animal Haven hosted its largest event yet, the grand opening of the new Rescue and Recovery Pavilion. Families filled the courtyard. Children laughed. Rescued dogs ran playfully across the green lawn, no longer afraid. And in the center of it all stood Thomas Riley, humbled by how far they'd come. Beside him, Benny wore a red bandana embroidered with the words, "Every life matters." His eyes scanned the crowd, his demeanor calm but watchful. Still the little guardian dog who once refused to let help drive away. Thomas stepped onto the small stage, microphone in hand, heart full. The applause settled as he looked out across the sea of faces. "A year ago," he began, "I was a man who believed in structure, in schedules, in doing what was expected. I drove a bus, same route, same routine, never thinking twice, until one day a dog stood in front of my bus and wouldn't let me move. That moment, just a few seconds long, changed everything." He paused, letting the silence carry the weight of those words. Because that dog, Benny, wasn't just asking for help. He was help. For someone else. For me. He reminded me what we're all capable of when we stop, listen, and follow even the smallest signs of distress. The crowd stood motionless, caught in the truth of his words. "We saved one life that day," Thomas continued, "but since then, we've saved hundreds and inspired thousands more to act, all because one dog said no to walking away." He gestured toward Benny, who perked up at his name, tail wagging. "So today isn't just a celebration of what we built," Thomas said. "It's a reminder that any one of us can make a difference, even if all you're doing is following a bark." When he stepped down, the crowd erupted in cheers. Benny barked once, loud, clear, proud. Thomas bent down and whispered in his ear, "We did it, buddy." After the event, Thomas, Nora, and Benny sat on the shelter's back patio, watching the sun dip low in the sky. Nora sipped tea. Benny lay with his head on Thomas's boot. Peace settled around them. "You know," Nora said, "I think you were meant to drive that bus that morning, and meant to stop." Thomas nodded slowly. "Yeah, I just didn't know it until he told me." That night at home, Thomas wrote his final entry in the small leather journal he'd kept throughout the year. What began with one bark became a movement. What started as a rescue became a mission. And what I found in Benny was a purpose I never knew I needed. This is no longer just his story, it's ours, and it's still being written. As he closed the journal, Benny hopped onto the couch beside him, curling into the crook of his arm. The two sat there in comfortable silence. No alarms, no emergencies, no fear. Just a man, a dog, and the bond that saved them both. And if this story moved you, if you believe in the power of compassion, loyalty, and second chances, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. Because somewhere out there, another Benny is waiting, and the world needs more people who are willing to follow. Click now to see our next incredible story. It's one you won't forget.